The 1958 plane crash that destroyed one of soccer's greatest teams. The accident, in which many members of a legendary team died, haunted Manchester United for years. It is 66 years since the Munich air disaster robbed English football of one of its greatest young teams. 8 Manchester United players from Sir Matt Busby's brilliant side were killed and the plane carrying them crashed on February 6, 1958, and 2 more were so badly injured they never played again. 15 others aboard also died. As the snowflakes fluttered across the airfield, the temptation was too much for 2 of the younger players in Manchester United's travelling party. Eddie Colman, 21, was the first to scoop up a handful of snow from the ground. David Pegg, 22, soon joined him. The 2 were best friends and suddenly snowballs were being launched through the air. Hours later, both would be dead, along with 21 other passengers aboard British European Airways Flight 609. It was early afternoon on Thursday, February 6, 1958, and the twin-engined Airspeed AS-57 Ambassador, a model known as the Elizabethan, carrying manager Matt Busby and his United players, had just landed at Munich Airport for refueling on its way back to England from the team's European Cup quarter-final second leg against Red Star Belgrade in the old Yugoslavia, now Serbia. Spirits were high. The previous night, United had overcome their Yugoslav opponents, drawing 3-3 with 2 Bobby Charlton goals and another from Dennis Viollet to progress 5-4 on aggregate. The Busby Babes, with an average age of 22, were in the semi-finals for the second successive season and, in the warmth of the terminal in Munich, somebody started singing the Dean Martin classic, Baby, It's Cold Outside. Colman, nicknamed Snake Hips because of the way he used to shimmy past opponents, fetched a round of hot drinks. Others went to buy presents for their loved ones. Johnny Berry, one of the senior players, was keeping the shop assistant busy behind the toy counter, winding up mechanical cars to pick out the ones that his 3 young boys would like best. They were a happy group. Frank Taylor, the only survivor among the 9 journalists aboard Flight 609, recalled in his book, The Day A Team Died. Anybody who was anybody in British football was quite convinced that Matt Busby had brought to Old Trafford the most talented group of footballers ever seen at one club. The Elizabethan was so highly rated within the aviation industry it had been used to fly Queen Elizabeth II to her international appointments. The passenger cabin was made up of 10 4-seat rows, the first 4 facing the tail, then 6 facing the cockpit, and by the time the plane was ready to leave Munich for home it had a total of 44 people aboard. The BEA Elizabethan airliner which crashed at Munich, PA/PA images via Getty Images. 2 card schools were underway, involving 9 players. One had Barry, Roger Byrne and Liam Whalen sitting across from Ray Wood and Jackie Blanchflower. The other was a 4-hander involving Pegg, Bill Fowlkes, Kenny Morgans and Albert Scanlon. Charlton, then 20, was one of United's golden apples, to use the phrase of coach Jimmy Murphy, and had already shown the uncommon talent that led to him being recognized as one of the greatest footballers in the history of the sport. He was sitting towards the front beside Viollet, another regular source of United's goals. Harry Gregg, the goalkeeper, was on the other side, spread across 2 seats so he could have a well-deserved nap, having withstood a fierce second-half onslaught from Red Star in the JNA Stadium that had seen them score 3 unanswered goals. Busby, whose managerial achievements by that stage already featured 3 league championships and an FA Cup, looked tired and grey. The Scot was one of the doyens of his profession, in his 13th year as United's manager, but he had been in hospital a few days earlier for an operation on some varicose veins in his leg. Not a major procedure, perhaps, but one that had sapped his energy. He and his staff were in the middle rows and, behind them, there was football's original boy wonder, Duncan Edwards, a player still often cited as one of the greatest young talents England has ever produced. Also in that section were Colman, Mark Jones, Tommy Taylor and Jeff Bent. The back rows were taken up by reporters, many of whom were looking forward to the annual Manchester Press Ball that evening. The propellers roared into action, the plane began picking up speed and the slush started to fly off the wheels. But it quickly became apparent something was wrong. The co-pilot, Kenneth Raymond, had detected excessive boost pressure, or surging, and knew it risked the engines malfunctioning in midair. The brakes were applied with enough force to pitch one of the stewards, Tommy Cable, into the seat in front of him. It was his colleague, Margaret Bellis, who announced there was a technical fault and that everything would be fixed as quickly as possible if everyone could kindly disembark and return to the terminal. The plane had been on the move for 40 seconds. For the passengers, there was a bit of consternation and all the sorts of questions and theories that you would expect in those circumstances. Had the engine cut out? Was it snow on the wings? Any sign of the weather letting up? They were entitled to have a few concerns, given that it had been less than a year since another British European Airways aircraft, flying in from Amsterdam, had crashed near Manchester's own airport, with the loss of 22 lives. Busby and his players also knew from experience, collectively and individually, that technical fault was just the catch-all explanation for any sort of hitch or mishap preventing a plane from leaving on time. In the Spanish city of Bilbao a year earlier, United's flight was not going anywhere until the entire team disembarked to clear ice and snow from the wings. Greg, a Northern Ireland international, had once returned from a game in Belfast on a plane that lost a propeller in midair. As everyone trooped back into the terminal, Alf Clark, the Manchester Evening Chronicle's correspondent, estimated it would be 2 to 3 hours before they were ready to take off. Clark had flown in the First World War and, as such, had a bit of gravitas among his fellow passengers. Jones, the centre-half, headed to the duty-free shop, where he bought himself a St. Christopher medal, the patron saint of travellers. More coffees were ordered and there was considerable surprise when, before they could be finished, the call came for everyone to return to the aircraft. Again, the passengers took their seats, strapped themselves in and readied for takeoff. Again, the nose wheel refused to lift. The brakes went on and the plane juddered to a halt on a layer of white-brown slush. This was the second failed attempt to get off the runway. And this time, one voice rose above the others. It belonged to Frank Swift, the former England goalkeeper, whose 16 years at Manchester City had involved winning the 1936-37 championship and, 2 years earlier, the FA Cup. Aged 44, Swift was on the plane as part of a new career writing about football for the News of the World. He was a big, amiable man, but there was unmistakable alarm in his voice. "What the hell is going on?" he was shouting. The prospect of getting back to Manchester appeared to be receding as the passengers squelched to the terminal for a third time. Those 2 aborted takeoffs had been unnerving for everyone and, as the players talked between themselves about the possibility of having to stay in Germany overnight, Edward sent a telegram to his landlady in Manchester. His words made it clear he had given up hope of a return that day. All flights cancelled. Flying tomorrow, Duncan. Again, though, an announcement came for everybody to return to the plane. It had been very quick, which added to the sense of unease. Could they really have fixed the problem in so little time? Greg and Blanchflower had not even had time to spark up their cigarettes. Blanchflower stuck one behind his ear and the pair of them exited the terminal to head into the snow again. "The weather was as bad as I had ever seen it on my football travels," Charlton would later say. There were 6 or 7 inches of slush on the runway. Nobody, though, challenged the decision to make a third attempt. Busby wanted the players to get back to Manchester so they could have a full day's rest before playing Wolves that Saturday. The pilot, James Thane, had been given the clearance to try again and, if any of the passengers thought it was crazy, nobody had the gumption to speak up. As Greg would later say, sometimes it takes a brave man to be a coward. Instead, the players were counted back on, one by one, and at 2:59 p.m. a radio message crackled up to the control tower: "Are we cleared?" On board, there was a mix of bravado and butterflies. Pegg, a brilliant, elusive left-winger who had tormented Real Madrid in the previous season's European Cup semi-finals, announced he did not want to play cards anymore. "I don't like it here, it's not safe," he said, moving to the rear of the plane to find a seat near Colman. "That's right, lads, this is the safest end," Swift called out. Byrne, United's captain, did not like flying at the best of times. He tried to make light out of it and joked that it was all or nothing now. Barry, another reluctant flyer, seemed gripped by fear. Greg, experiencing his own sense of foreboding, tried to crack a few jokes. He had a copy of a book called The Whip, a titillating piece of fiction that was regarded at the time as a bit risque. "It was playing on my conscience," he would say. "I thought, if anything happens here," at 117 knots, 135 miles per hour, he called out, V1, velocity 1, the point at which it was unsafe to abandon takeoff. In usual circumstances, the next step would have been to call V2, at 119 knots, the speed required for takeoff. But that was the moment the needle started dropping. The plane, coded 609 Zulu uniform, JLZU, had become a death trap. Suddenly, it was 112, then 105. Thane was banging furiously on the throttle, trying to do something, anything, to get some more power from the two engines. When he next looked up, he could see they were running out of runway. There was a road ahead, a farmhouse, a perimeter fence, some trees and a lot of snow. In that split second, he and his co-pilot knew disaster was imminent. "Christ," shouted Raymond. "We aren't going to make it." For reasons he could never fully explain, Greg had already loosened his tie and unfastened the top button of his shirt. As fear washed over him, he slid his frame downwards in his seat, preparing for the impact. Fawkes, seated in front of him, was also bracing himself. Someone began to laugh, in a nervous kind of way. "What are you laughing at?" Barry shouted out, obvious fear in his voice. "We're all going to get fucking killed here." The plane kept going, speeding past a red outbuilding that it had stopped almost opposite on the previous two runs. Staring out of the window, Charlton could see field after field flashing past. He knew this could not continue. Then the 22-year-old Whalen, a devout Catholic from the Republic of Ireland, said something that over the years would be a comfort, of sorts, for his family in Dublin. "If this is death, I am ready for it," he said. Thane, a day short of his 37th birthday, knew he had to take emergency action. The pilot shouted undercarriage up and retracted the wheels, so the plane could slide on its belly and, in theory, come to a quicker stop. There was a bounce, a change of motion and, briefly, a sense among some of the passengers that they might be airborne. In fact, the plane never left the ground. It had skidded off the runway and, at 3:04 p.m., the final call came from the stricken Elizabethan. "Munich, from B-line Zulu Unif." The words stopped abruptly. All that was left was a howling, whistling noise and then, audible from the control tower, a succession of terrible bangs. All these years later, it is fair to say the death count would not have been so devastating if safety precautions which are standard today were applied in 1958. Hypothetical, perhaps, but there may not have been any fatalities at all if the fencing had been further back from the runway, or if there had not been so many buildings in close proximity, including a wooden hut containing a truck loaded with drums of fuel. When the plane was torn apart, one section careered into that hut, creating a fireball. As the plane crossed a road, Thane could see there was not enough room to get between a farmhouse and a large tree. Inside that house, Anna Winkler was sewing in the front room when she heard the terrifying sound of an out-of-control aircraft heading straight in her direction. Still traveling at high speed, the left wing of the plane struck the farmhouse. That wing was torn off and parts of the tail unit, too, but the bulk of the plane continued on its deadly path. Fuel sprayed out of the ruptured wing tanks and the house was engulfed in flames. As the fire took hold, Winkler had to throw two of her young children into the snow. A third, aged 4, escaped through a window. Fawkes, one of the survivors, felt a sickening thud, and then another one, and then another one, and then a terrific crash, and then we were spinning all over the place. He saw sky, and then blackness. Busby recalled how time seemed to stand still. We sped on and on and on, and my thoughts sounded just like that, on and on and on and on, until they changed to too long, too long, too long, too long. We were not going up. I threw out my arms in a pathetic attempt at self-protection. Charlton bent his head down and braced himself for the impact. I didn't hear the semblance of a scream. There had just been a vast and empty silence in the plane. I suppose we were in shock, overwhelmed with disbelief. The last thing I remember, before coming round away from the plane, was the terrible rending noise of metal on metal. The next collision was a tree ripping open the cockpit on Raymond's side. What was left of the undercarriage had been torn away, and a number of passengers got thrown into the snow. Busby was one of them, Charlton another. Blanchflower was catapulted out of the top of the plane. When he tried to pick himself up, checking each limb was still intact, he thought at first he must have been paralyzed. The reason he could not move was because Byrne, still strapped into his seat, was across his legs. He was dead. Blanchflower lay with his teammate in profound shock, trying to take it all in, watching the seconds tick by on Byrne's watch. Spinning and lurching completely out of control, the aircraft hurtled on. A lorry driver on the nearby autobahn saw a wheel fly off and shoot in his direction. The collision with the fuel truck had ripped open the starboard fuselage. The plane slithered on for a further 70 meters, its remaining wing felling trees like a giant scythe. Then, finally, the cacophony of tearing and breaking metal ended. 54 seconds after the throttle was opened, the once sleek, elegant Elizabethan came to a standstill as a broken, shattered wreck. Less than a minute previously, I had been sitting in the company of the young kings of British soccer, Frank Taylor wrote. Now they lay dead or dying, or brutally injured and dumbly shocked by the tragedy which had hit them. No one cried out, another survivor, Daily Mail photographer Peter Howard, said afterwards. No one spoke, just a deadly silence. The whole aircraft was enveloped with flames, Thane recalled. We seemed to be spinning all over the place. There was a tremendous noise, and then, quite suddenly, no noise at all. Absolute quiet, almost uncanny. When Greg opened his eyes, he could feel the blood coming down my face. I didn't dare put my hand up because I thought the top of my head had been taken off, like a hard-boiled egg. Looking through a hole in the buckled, broken fuselage, the first person he saw was Bert Wally, United's youth team coach, lying beneath him. He was wearing a blue shirt and a blue cardigan. It was Bert who had nurtured so many of the young players. He was motionless, his eyes were open, and there wasn't a mark on him. Somehow, I still knew he was dead. Recovering his wits, Greg kicked the hole bigger and crawled outside to find 4 or 5 fires burning around the plane. Thane had already got out and was shouting to get away. Go on, run. Get away, before the whole thing exploded. Dazed and concussed, Greg stood for a moment, taking in the devastation and the stench of fuel. Every bit of common sense was telling him to flee to safety. But that was not an option he was willing to take. He started climbing back into the wreckage. There's people alive in here. What he had to see in there was almost unspeakable. For Greg, however, sheer courage took over as he set about looking for survivors. He heard a baby's cry and followed the noise until he found 22-month-old Vesna Lukic, daughter of a Yugoslav diplomat in London. Her mother, Vera, was nearby. Greg managed to haul them, both badly injured, to safety. To me, Harry Gregg has always been Superman, Vera would say many years later. Fawkes, a 26-year-old centre-back, had woken up to find fires burning and Thane fighting the flames with an extinguisher. His first instinct was to run and, to begin with, that is what Fawkes did until, recovering from his initial panic, he returned to the wreckage and joined in the rescue operation. He found Busby, sitting up on one arm, semi-conscious and in severe shock, complaining about the pain in his legs. United's manager, then 48, was ice-cold, clutching his chest. Fawkes put a coat over him. He and Gregg vigorously rubbed Busby's hands until expert help arrived. Bobby Charlton was close by, still strapped in his seat, Fawkes recalled. He seemed to be slumped over and I thought he'd had it, but, suddenly, as if he was waking out of sleep, he took off his safety belt, stood up and walked over to us. Dennis Violet, who was also sitting in his seat, did exactly the same thing and I began to think everyone was all right. 30 yards further on, the reality became shatteringly clear when Fawkes found Byrne folded over his seat as if his back was broken. Byrne, the oldest player to die, aged 28, was one of the most stylish left-backs ever to play for England. Fawkes knew straight away that United's captain was beyond help. Thane had returned to the cockpit and used an axe to free his co-pilot, whose legs were broken in several places and jammed in the wreckage of the pedals. Raymond, who had fallen into unconsciousness, was taken to hospital, where he died 5 weeks later from head injuries. Steward Cable was also killed. 20 of the passengers were dead before the ambulances arrived, their bodies either flung from the fuselage or pinned under the chaos of metal and fire.